On July 3, 1863, as Confederate General Pickett's charge thundered across the Pennsylvania fields toward Cemetery Ridge, something impossible walked among the wounded soldiers of Gettysburg. Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman whose medical records would later confound 3 generations of physicians, moved between the dying men with hands that had not aged a single day in over 2 decades. Survivors of that bloodiest battle would swear under oath that the same woman who tended their wounds in 1863 had delivered their children in Baltimore 23 years earlier, unchanged, unaged, as if time itself had forgotten her existence. Military surgeons documented her presence. Town records bore her signature, yet no medical journal of the era could explain what dozens of witnesses claimed to see. The United States Army Medical Department buried her case file in 1864, stamping it with a classification that would remain sealed for nearly a century. Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth Caldwell, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling historical mysteries that official records tried to bury. Comment below and tell us what state you're listening from, because tonight's tale proves that some secrets run deeper than any government archive ever intended. The woman who defied every known law of human biology was about to become the most documented medical anomaly of the Civil War era. And her story begins not on the battlefields of Pennsylvania, but in the gaslit streets of Baltimore, where whispers of her strange condition first began to spread through the medical community like wildfire. Baltimore in 1840 stood as one of America's great port cities, where steamships brought European immigrants by the thousands and railroad lines stretched toward the expanding frontier. The city's cobblestone streets echoed with a dozen languages, while its hospitals and medical colleges attracted some of the nation's most ambitious physicians. The humid Chesapeake climate created perfect conditions for disease outbreaks that tested the limits of medical knowledge, making Baltimore's physicians among the most experienced in treating unusual conditions. It was here, in the respectable neighborhood of Mount Vernon, that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell first encountered the woman who would haunt his medical practice for the next quarter century. Elizabeth Caldwell arrived at his clinic on Charles Street during the autumn of 1840, seeking treatment for what she described as persistent fatigue. Dr. Hartwell recently graduated from the University of Maryland Medical School with honors in anatomical studies, noted in his journal that she appeared to be approximately 28 years of age, with auburn hair, green eyes, and the pale complexion common among women of good breeding. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, owned a successful shipping firm with contracts throughout the Chesapeake Bay region, transporting tobacco from Virginia plantations and manufactured goods from northern cities. They lived quietly in a 3-story brick townhouse on Monument Street, attended Presbyterian services regularly at Franklin Street Church, and seemed unremarkable in every way except for one troubling detail that would emerge only with the passage of time. Mrs. Caldwell's medical file, preserved in the archives of Baltimore's Mercy General Hospital, contains routine entries spanning 23 years, births attended, minor ailments treated, seasonal consultations for various family members, and detailed annual physical examinations that Dr. Hartwell insisted upon maintaining for all his regular patients. Yet buried within these mundane records lies a mystery that 3 different physicians would independently document, each reaching the same impossible conclusion. Elizabeth Caldwell was not aging at the expected rate. Dr. Hartwell's careful measurements, recorded annually during routine examinations using the most precise instruments available, showed no significant changes in her physical appearance between 1840 and 1850. Her height remained constant at 5 feet 4 inches. Her weight fluctuated only with seasonal changes, and her bone density showed none of the gradual decline expected in women approaching 40 years of age. The Baltimore medical community of the 1850s operated under strict protocols established by the Maryland State Medical Society. Physicians kept meticulous records, shared unusual cases through professional correspondence published in the Baltimore Medical Journal, and maintained detailed patient files that could withstand scrutiny from colleagues during monthly medical society meetings. When Dr. Hartwell first mentioned the Caldwell anomaly during a presentation on unusual aging patterns in 1855, his fellow physicians dismissed it as observation bias or record-keeping errors. But as more doctors examined Mrs. Caldwell over the years for childbirth, injuries, routine health concerns, and family medical emergencies, a disturbing pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Multiple independent observers, trained at different medical schools and practicing different specialties, were documenting the same impossible thing. A woman who appeared to be aging at perhaps 1/3 the normal rate. Thomas Caldwell's shipping business thrived during the 1850s boom years, allowing the family to maintain their social standing despite whispered speculation about his wife's unusually youthful appearance. Elizabeth bore 3 children between 1842 and 1848, Margaret, Thomas Jr., and little Sarah, each birth documented by different physicians who noted her remarkable recovery rate and unchanged physical condition. Society matrons in Baltimore's fashionable circles began to comment privately about Mrs. Caldwell's apparent use of European cosmetics or other beauty treatments, though none could identify what methods might produce such dramatic results. The family's Presbyterian minister, Reverend Samuel Wickham, mentioned in his personal diary that Elizabeth Caldwell looked precisely the same in 1860 as she had when he'd first met her in 1841, describing it as a curiosity of divine providence that confounds mortal understanding and challenges our assumptions about the natural progression of earthly life. As tensions between North and South intensified in the late 1850s, Baltimore found itself increasingly divided along political and economic lines. The city's position on the Mason-Dixon line made it a crucial strategic location, and families like the Caldwells faced difficult choices about their loyalties. Thomas Caldwell's shipping contracts included both northern and southern ports, making political neutrality essential for business survival. But when war finally came in 1861, neutrality became impossible to maintain, and the Caldwell family would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would ultimately provide the perfect opportunity to document Elizabeth's impossible condition under the most scrutinized circumstances in American history. The Baltimore riot of April 19, 1861, shattered whatever illusions the Caldwell family had maintained about remaining neutral in the coming conflict. As the 6th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment attempted to march through Baltimore toward Washington, D.C., Confederate sympathizers attacked the Union soldiers with stones, bricks, and gunfire in the narrow streets around Camden Station. 12 civilians and 4 soldiers died in the violence, while dozens more lay wounded in the cobblestone streets that ran red with blood. The riot marked the first bloodshed of the Civil War on Maryland soil, and it would provide the first documented evidence of Elizabeth Caldwell's extraordinary medical capabilities under crisis conditions. Elizabeth Caldwell was present at the riot, though her reasons for being near the train station that morning remain unclear from surviving records. Some witnesses claimed she had been shopping at the nearby Lexington market, while others suggested she was visiting the station to meet arriving relatives. What is documented, however, is her immediate response to the carnage that erupted around her. Witnesses later testified before a military tribunal that she moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency, stanching bleeding with strips torn from her own petticoats, providing comfort to dying men with words that seemed to calm even the most agitated patients, and organizing other women to assist in medical care with the authority of someone who had managed similar crises before. Dr. Marcus Fleming, chief surgeon at Baltimore's University Hospital, arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the violence began to find Mrs. Caldwell already directing an improvised field hospital in Hearst's warehouse near the station. The sight that greeted him would fundamentally challenge his understanding of civilian medical capabilities and remain vivid in his memory for the rest of his career. Elizabeth had organized the available space with surgical precision, separating the wounded by severity of injury, establishing clean and contaminated areas, and implementing infection control procedures that exceeded the standards practiced in most established hospitals. The woman possessed medical knowledge far beyond what any respectable lady should know. Dr. Fleming wrote in his official report to the Maryland State Medical Board. She understood human anatomy with the precision of a trained physician, spoke knowledgeably about surgical procedures with technical vocabulary that suggested formal education, and demonstrated familiarity with wound treatment that indicated extensive prior experience with traumatic injuries. When I inquired about her background, she claimed only to have assisted in family medical matters over the years and to have read extensively in her husband's medical texts. Yet her competence suggested formal training or prolonged exposure to battlefield conditions that seemed impossible for a woman of her social class and apparent age. More troubling than her medical expertise was the recognition she received from wounded soldiers and civilians alike. At least 7 witnesses, interviewed separately by military investigators over the following weeks, claimed to remember Elizabeth Caldwell from previous encounters spanning back over 15 years. An Irish immigrant named Patrick O'Malley insisted she had delivered his first child in 1845, appearing exactly as she did in 1861, down to a distinctive scar on her left hand from what she had described as a childhood accident. A Confederate sympathizer, wounded in the riot, swore she had treated his brother's injuries during a dock accident in 1847, showing no signs of aging in the intervening 14 years. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Union Captain James Hendricks, who claimed that Mrs. Caldwell had attended his wedding reception in 1843 and looked precisely the same 18 years later, even wearing what appeared to be the same emerald earrings she had worn on that long-ago evening. Dr. Fleming's report concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. I recommend that military medical authorities take note of Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell should she appear at future battle sites. Her medical knowledge appears to exceed that of many trained surgeons, and her apparent immunity to the aging process warrants scientific investigation, though I acknowledge the impossibility of the latter phenomenon under any known medical theory. There are aspects of this woman's capabilities that challenge our fundamental understanding of human physiology and deserve further study under controlled conditions. The Baltimore riot marked a turning point not only in the Civil War, but in Elizabeth Caldwell's documented history. Military records from that day forward would track her movements with increasing precision, creating a paper trail that would become impossible to ignore or explain away. As Union and Confederate forces prepared for larger battles ahead, the woman who never aged was about to step onto the most scrutinized battlefield in American history, where her presence would be recorded by dozens of independent observers whose testimonies would create an unshakable foundation of evidence for her impossible condition. The aftermath of the Baltimore riot sent ripples throughout the medical and military establishments that would eventually converge at Gettysburg. Union Army Medical Director Dr. Jonathan Letterman, tasked with revolutionizing battlefield medicine for the massive armies now mobilizing, had received Dr. Fleming's report about Elizabeth Caldwell and filed it with a growing collection of unusual cases that defied medical explanation. The Civil War was producing unprecedented opportunities for medical observation, as thousands of physicians encountered conditions and phenomena never before documented in peacetime practice. Cases of unusual healing rates, inexplicable survival from mortal wounds, and bizarre physiological anomalies were being reported from military hospitals across the country, but none as consistently documented as the Baltimore woman who seemed immune to aging. Thomas Caldwell's shipping business collapsed within months of the riot, a casualty of the political divisions that were tearing Maryland apart. Confederate sympathizers boycotted his services for his wife's aid to Union soldiers, while Union authorities questioned his loyalty due to his previous Southern contracts and his family's known connections to Virginia plantation owners. By late 1861, the family had lost most of their Baltimore properties to creditors and faced social ostracism from both sides of the political divide. Elizabeth, however, seemed energized rather than discouraged by these reversals, as if the crisis had awakened something dormant within her. She began volunteering at military hospitals around Baltimore, her medical skills growing more sophisticated with each passing month in ways that puzzled experienced physicians. Hospital records from 1862 reveal an extraordinary pattern of patient improvement under Elizabeth Caldwell's care that defied statistical probability. Union soldiers suffering from typhoid fever, dysentery, and infected wounds showed recovery rates nearly double the average when she was assigned to their treatment. Dr. Rutledge, still her personal physician despite the family's reduced circumstances, noted that her medical knowledge appeared to be expanding at an impossible rate, as if she were accumulating decades of experience within months. Mrs. Caldwell discusses surgical techniques that I learned only after years of practice, he wrote in February 1862. She describes procedures for treating compound fractures that were taught to me by professors who had studied in Europe, yet she claims no formal training. When I ask about her knowledge, she speaks vaguely of natural aptitude and careful observation of others' work. Yet her competence suggests direct instruction from master surgeons or extensive hands-on experience that she could not have acquired in Baltimore. More unsettling were the reports from patients themselves, documented by hospital chaplains who made regular rounds to provide spiritual comfort to wounded soldiers. Soldiers recovering under Elizabeth's care frequently mentioned dreams or half-conscious memories of her presence during their treatment that contradicted the official duty schedules. These accounts, recorded in the chaplain's daily logs, described a woman who seemed to work tirelessly throughout the night, moving between patients with supernatural endurance, while other nurses collapsed from exhaustion. Private William Kerner of the 2nd Maryland Infantry left a particularly detailed account in a letter to his sister. She never seemed to tire, never appeared different from one day to the next, while the rest of us showed the strain of this terrible war. Other nurses would show exhaustion after 12-hour shifts, but Mrs. Caldwell remained constant, as fresh in the morning as she had been the evening before. It was as if she existed outside the normal flow of time that governed the rest of us, immune to the fatigue that plagued everyone else in that place of suffering. By spring of 1863, Elizabeth Caldwell had acquired a reputation throughout the Union Army Medical Corps as both a gifted healer and a source of growing unease among medical professionals. Surgeons specifically requested her assistance for difficult cases, yet privately questioned the source of her knowledge in letters to colleagues and family members. Soldiers spoke of her with something approaching reverence, but their testimonies contained undertones of fear that they could not articulate. She had become indispensable to the war effort while simultaneously becoming impossible to explain. A contradiction that troubled military physicians who prided themselves on rational scientific approaches to medicine. The medical mystery of Elizabeth Caldwell might have remained confined to Baltimore hospitals if not for a chance encounter in May 1863 that would change everything. Clara Barton, already famous as the angel of the battlefield for her work with wounded soldiers, arrived at Baltimore's Jarvis Hospital to observe treatment methods that could be applied to field hospitals closer to the front lines. Her meeting with Elizabeth Caldwell lasted only 2 hours, but Barton's private correspondence reveals its profound impact on someone who thought she had seen everything the war could offer. I have encountered a woman whose medical abilities exceed those of trained physicians with decades of experience, she wrote to her sister Sally. Yet there is something deeply troubling about her that I cannot articulate or fully understand. She speaks of medical procedures with the authority of someone who has witnessed them countless times, though she appears younger than myself. More disturbing, she discusses future battles as if she has already witnessed them, describing wounds and conditions that have not yet occurred, but which, I fear, inevitably will. Clara Barton's recommendation would prove fateful for both Elizabeth Caldwell and the thousands of soldiers who would soon converge on a small Pennsylvania town. When Union forces began concentrating in Pennsylvania during June 1863, preparing for what would become the Battle of Gettysburg, military medical planners specifically requested Elizabeth Caldwell's assignment to the Army of the Potomac's Medical Corps. The woman who had defied aging for over 20 years was about to enter the most documented and scrutinized battle of the Civil War, where her presence would be recorded by dozens of independent observers whose testimonies would create an unshakable foundation of evidence for her impossible condition. The Army of the Potomac's movement toward Gettysburg in June 1863 represented the largest concentration of military medical personnel in American history up to that point. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's reformed ambulance corps included over 650 surgeons, assistant surgeons, and hospital stewards, creating an unprecedented network of trained observers who would document every aspect of the coming battle with scientific precision. Among these medical professionals, Elizabeth Caldwell's reputation had spread through official channels and private correspondence, making her one of the most anticipated and scrutinized volunteers in the entire medical corps. Word of the Baltimore woman who never aged had reached physicians from Massachusetts to Maryland, creating expectations and curiosity that would prove impossible to satisfy with conventional explanations. Elizabeth arrived in Gettysburg on June 28, 1863, traveling with a supply convoy from Baltimore that included medical equipment donated by wealthy families and volunteer nurses recruited from Presbyterian churches throughout Maryland. The small Pennsylvania town, with its population of just 2,400 residents, was already straining under the influx of both armies converging in the region. Local physician Dr. Robert Horner, whose practice served Adams County and whose family had lived in the area for 3 generations, agreed to provide lodging for female medical volunteers in his family's home on Baltimore Street. His first encounter with Elizabeth Caldwell, recorded in meticulous detail in his personal journal that night, would become one of the most important primary source documents regarding her condition. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at my door on the evening of June 28th, accompanied by 2 other volunteer nurses from Baltimore whose names I have forgotten. Dr. Horner wrote, "I was immediately struck by her youthful appearance, which seemed inconsistent with the extensive medical knowledge she demonstrated during our conversation about the challenges we would likely face in the coming days. When I mentioned that she reminded me of a woman I had met during my medical training in Philadelphia 20 years earlier, she became evasive and changed the subject to discuss the town's water supply and its adequacy for hospital use. Later that evening, I consulted my old medical school notebooks and found my description of a Miss Elizabeth Hartwell who had assisted in a difficult surgery at Pennsylvania Hospital in 1843. The physical description was identical to Mrs. Caldwell in every detail, including a distinctive birthmark near her left ear and the unusual green color of her eyes. Such resemblance would be impossible unless she had been the same person, unchanged by 2 decades of time. Dr. Horner's suspicions deepened when he examined Elizabeth's medical supplies and instruments the following morning. Her surgical kit contained tools of exceptional quality, some bearing manufacturing marks from European firms that had not been available in America 20 years earlier. The scalpels were made from German steel of a grade used only by the most prestigious medical schools, while her suturing materials included silk thread of a quality that cost more than most physicians earned in a month. Yet the wear patterns on these instruments suggested decades of regular use, with the handles polished smooth by countless hours of surgical work. More puzzling still were her medical texts, leather-bound volumes with extensive marginalia in what appeared to be the same handwriting across publications spanning 15 years. The annotations revealed deep understanding of surgical techniques that had only recently been developed in European medical schools. Yet the ink showed varying degrees of age, suggesting they had been made over many years of study and practice. On the morning of June 30th, as Confederate and Union forces began positioning themselves around Gettysburg in preparation for what both sides expected to be a decisive battle, Elizabeth requested permission to survey the likely battlefield areas to identify suitable locations for field hospitals. Dr. Horner accompanied her on this reconnaissance, during which he demonstrated knowledge of the local terrain that seemed impossible for a first-time visitor to Adams County. She pointed out natural features, elevation changes, and water sources with the familiarity of someone who had studied detailed topographical maps for weeks. When questioned about her knowledge, she claimed to have read extensively about Pennsylvania geography, yet her observations included details about underground springs and drainage patterns that appeared in no published sources available to civilian readers. More mysterious was Elizabeth's apparent ability to predict where the heaviest fighting would occur, displaying tactical knowledge that exceeded that of many military officers. Walking across what would become known as Cemetery Ridge, she selected a spot near a small copse of trees and announced, "This location will see the worst carnage. We should prepare our largest field hospital here, with emphasis on treating abdominal wounds and traumatic amputations." Dr. Horner found her certainty unsettling, particularly since no military commanders had yet announced their battle plans, and the terrain offered no obvious tactical advantages. When the fighting began on July 1st, her predictions proved unnervingly accurate, as if she had witnessed the battle before it occurred. The first day of battle brought Elizabeth Caldwell into contact with dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel who would later provide testimony about her unprecedented performance under battlefield conditions. Unlike other civilian volunteers who required time to adjust to the horror and chaos of combat medicine, Elizabeth moved among the wounded with immediate competence and seemingly inexhaustible energy that amazed seasoned military surgeons. Surgeon Charles McMillan of the 1st Minnesota Infantry noted that she worked continuously for 18 hours without showing signs of fatigue, treating wounds with speed and skill that exceeded most trained military surgeons, while maintaining perfect composure despite the screams of wounded men and the constant thunder of artillery. But it was during the evening of July 1st that the most disturbing testimonies emerged from multiple independent sources. As medical personnel worked through the night by candlelight and oil lamps, several witnesses independently observed Elizabeth Caldwell in situations that defied logical explanation. Hospital steward William Crawford recorded that she appeared to be working simultaneously in 3 different locations, treating patients in the Lutheran Seminary, the Catholic Church, and a temporary field hospital near Rock Creek. Since these locations were over a mile apart and the roads between them were crowded with military traffic, Crawford initially dismissed his observations as confusion caused by exhaustion. However, other witnesses reported similar sightings, leading to speculation that either multiple women resembling Elizabeth were present, or that she possessed some means of moving between locations faster than seemed humanly possible given the conditions of a nighttime battlefield. The second day of fighting at Gettysburg brought unprecedented carnage, and with it, the most detailed documentation of Elizabeth Caldwell's mysterious capabilities that would ever be recorded. As Confederate forces launched coordinated attacks on both flanks of the Union line, the volume of wounded overwhelmed every prepared medical facility in ways that tested the limits of 19th century military medicine. Field hospitals established in churches, barns, and private homes filled beyond capacity, creating desperate conditions that tested every medical volunteer to their physical and emotional limits. Yet throughout the chaos of July the 2nd, multiple independent witnesses continued to document Elizabeth's impossible presence in locations that should have been physically unreachable given the constraints of time and distance. Dr. Cyrus Bacon, chief surgeon of the 2nd Corps and a graduate of Harvard Medical School, maintained detailed logs of personnel assignments and movements as part of the Army Medical Department's new documentation requirements. His records show Elizabeth Caldwell officially assigned to the field hospital at the Jacob Schwartz Farm, located south of Gettysburg, near the Round Tops, where Confederate attacks were expected to be heaviest. However, surgeon reports from that same day place her at the Granite Schoolhouse north of town, the George Spangler Farm to the east, and the Abraham Bryan House on Cemetery Ridge. Dr. Bacon's attempts to reconcile these conflicting reports led him to personally observe Elizabeth's movements on the afternoon of July the 2nd, resulting in documentation that would haunt his medical career for decades afterward. I followed Mrs. Caldwell from the Schwartz farm toward town at approximately 2:30 p.m., Dr. Bacon wrote in his official report to Medical Director Letterman. She walked at a normal pace along the Baltimore Pike, carrying her medical bag and showing no signs of unusual haste or supernatural locomotion. I lost sight of her when Confederate artillery fire forced me to take shelter behind a stone wall near the cemetery entrance. When the bombardment ceased approximately 10 minutes later, I proceeded directly to the Spangler farm to verify reports of her presence there. Upon arrival, I found Mrs. Caldwell already treating wounded soldiers, her clothing and hands showing clear evidence of recent surgical work, including blood stains that were still wet. The assistant surgeon assured me she had been working there continuously since early morning and had never left the premises. Given the distances involved and the timeline of my observations, her presence at both locations appears impossible under normal circumstances. The peculiarities surrounding Elizabeth's movements began manifesting in ways that defied not just observation, but logic itself. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien of the Irish Brigade was wounded during the assault on Devil's Den and transported to the field hospital at the Wycott farm. His account, recorded weeks later while recovering in Washington, D.C.,